Every autumn, when the breath of summer fades and the air grows thin with cold, the world seems to hesitate. The earth pauses between seasons, a stillness that feels almost deliberate. Crops have been gathered, the fields lie bare, and smoke curls from the last of the hearth fires. Yet beneath that surface calm, there lingers a quiet unease, as though the land itself is waiting for something to pass through. To the ancient Celts, this was no ordinary dusk. It was a hinge in the fabric of the year, a brief fracture when the walls between worlds grew porous. They believed that on this night, the living stood shoulder to shoulder with the dead, separated only by a breath, a flicker of flame, or the whisper of wind through the grass. Time did not move forward as it should, it folded back on itself, allowing the forgotten to wander freely once more. In those hours, the hills that rose gently by day became something else entirely, hollow, watchful, alive with murmurs. They were said to open from within, revealing chambers of lightless stone where ancient beings stirred. The people called them the Ish-Shi, the hidden folk, older than mankind and far less forgiving. Travelers who lingered too long on the roads at night sometimes vanished, leaving behind only the echo of footsteps on the frost. Inside the cottages, doors were barred and shutters drawn tight. The hearth fire, the heart of the home, was more than warmth. It was a fragile defense. Families huddled close, speaking softly so as not to draw attention from what might be listening beyond the threshold. For it was believed that the dead could find their way home on this night, following the scent of peat smoke and the memory of familiar voices. Some were welcomed, ancestors, kin, long-lost children, but others were not. Some came only to reclaim what they had lost, or to remind the living that their peace was borrowed. And so the people prepared, not with celebration, but with offerings. Bowls of food were left upon tables for unseen guests. Candles burned low, guiding spirits through the mist, while charms of rowan and ash were hung upon doorposts to keep the malevolent at bay. Still, few dared to step outside once darkness settled. Those who did swore they could hear faint music beneath the soil, like strings plucked deep underground. They called this night Samhain. It marked the death of the old year and the uncertain birth of the new. A night not of joy, but of reckoning. In its silence lay both memory and menace. The living, the dead, and the forgotten all breathed the same cold air, and for a brief trembling moment, the world remembered how thin the boundary truly was. Why then was this night both feared and revered? To understand that, one must look deeper into the rituals, the fires, and the ancient bargains made when the veil first began to shift.
Long before the name Samhain was whispered into the cold, the land itself dictated the rhythm of human life. For those who tilled the soil and drove their herds across the misty plains of ancient Ire, the year was carved not into months, but into thresholds. Turning points marked not on parchment, but in the quiet movements of the earth. Samhain stood at the edge of one such threshold, where the abundance of autumn sank into the silence of winter. It began with the harvest. As the last sheaves of grain were gathered beneath a darkening sky, there was an unspoken understanding that plenty was temporary. The fields, once golden, turned pale and brittle. The cattle, which had roamed freely in summer pastures, were herded inward toward the village enclosures. This was a season of counting, of animals, of stores, of lives. What was kept would see them through the winter. What was not would be offered up. Among the early Celts, the year itself was divided in two, the light half and the dark half. Samhain marked the boundary between them, not merely a date, but a crossing. It was, in a sense, their new year, though it was not celebrated with laughter. Instead, it was observed with calculation, solemnity, and fire. To step into the dark half of the year meant stepping into scarcity, into hunger, into a time when illness and frost took their quiet toll. The livestock cycle reveals much of the ritual's foundation. Only the strongest animals could be kept through the lean months. The rest were slaughtered at Samhain, their meat salted, dried, or smoked to last until the thaw. To outsiders, it may seem practical, a cold necessity, but to the people of the time, such acts were layered with meaning. Blood spilt on this night was not simply food prepared, it was tribute to the living community and to those who no longer belonged to it. Each household's fire was extinguished before nightfall. In darkness, the village gathered around a single great blaze lit by the Druids or the local chieftain. This was not just ceremony, it was renewal. From that one central fire, torches were carried back to each hearth, symbolizing the beginning of the dark year under a shared flame. The chieftain's role was more than leadership. He was the keeper of the communal threshold, ensuring that every ember returned to its home bore the blessing of protection. But this night also held a strange stillness, a moment when everything turned inward. Fields lay sleeping, animals enclosed, the world itself seeming to hold its breath. No crops were sown, no journeys begun. This was a pause in the calendar, a night that did not belong fully to the past or the future. And in such pauses, the people believed other forces crept closer.
Old Irish sources hint that Samhain was not just a turning of the year, it was a night when the kings of Tara convened, when laws were reaffirmed, debts acknowledged, and transgressions remembered. It was a night of reckoning, both worldly and otherworldly. And it is in that reckoning we see why the practical slowly gave way to the supernatural. To count cattle was also to count souls. To light a fire was to cast shadows. And in those shadows, they believed, something watched back. In later centuries, chroniclers would describe Samhain as a time between, when the she-mounds, those earthen hills scattered across the countryside, were said to open. But their opening was not random. It coincided with this precise moment of stillness, when communities gathered, accounted, and waited. The people did not make this night sacred out of whim. They recognized a pattern, a rhythm older than kings or kingdoms. Samhain belonged to the season itself, to the way the world falls silent before winter's grip. The fires burned high against that silence. They were meant to keep the cold away, yes, but also to hold the dark at the edge of the clearing. To the living, the flames were a sign of human order, of boundaries drawn against the creeping void. To the dead, they were something else entirely, a beacon, a reminder of where they once belonged. In this way, a night of practical preparation, harvests stored, animals culled, debts tallied, slowly blurred with something stranger. A line between survival and ritual, a line between the known and the hidden. Over time, the counting of grain and cattle became inseparable from the counting of the unseen. And so, Samhain emerged not merely as a seasonal marker, but as a hinge upon which the world turned. A night both feared and respected, structured and unstable, real and spectral. A night when, in the hush of the fields, the people prepared their homes, and the hollow hills prepared to answer. From this threshold between light and dark, practical necessity slipped into myth. A single night of reckoning became a doorway. A shared fire became a signal. And before long, the living were not alone in their counting.
That realization found its shape in fire. When the last household embers were banked and the fields lay bare, the village gathered not in merriment, but in a single, raw choreography. Hearths went out. One by one, the small flames that had kept life soft and private were smothered until homes were wrapped in an unfamiliar dark. In that deliberate extinguishing, there was an admission. The ordinary light could not be trusted. Into that hollow, a larger fire was raised, a communal blaze drawn from the throat of the night itself. The great fire was not simply bright, it was a language. It answered the hush in the fields with a vocabulary of sparks and smoke. Men and women brought torches, fed by seasoned peat and twisted straw. Children, their faces lit in the orange glare, clutched crude rattles or hollowed gourds, instruments meant to shatter silence. The chieftain, or a figure older and quieter, a keeper of rites, touched a flint and coaxed flame into being. That single ignition was passed from hand to hand until every hearth received a stolen tongue of heat. Returning embers were more than warmth. They were a dispensation, an authorized light that had moved through the community and back into the private world of each home. To carry it home was to carry the village's consent that the household belonged to the living for another season. Around the communal bonfire, the people did not sit to watch. They performed. They circled. They sang the old half-words that were as much charm as memory. Torches were waved, not as torches alone, but as staves of boundary. Men thrust them toward the dark fields and then drew them back as if to trace a line in the air, a temporary fence of flame. At intervals, the procession would halt and strike noise into the night. Horns blown into a cutthroat of sound, the sharp knock of wooden staves against stone, the clanging of metal pans. Sound, like fire, was a border. Where flame could not reach, sound might rush across, a beating of walls made of air. The purpose was simple and ancient, to claim the space, to make it unwelcoming to those who moved in silence. Smoke served a twin purpose. It was both veil and marker. Torches passed close to doorways, and smoke was allowed to thread beneath thresholds until lint and curtain smelled of peat. Some houses received ash rubbed across lintels, a smudge like a signature that said, "This door is guarded." The scent of smoke lingered in garments, on the backs of necks, in the hair of those who had come to the fire. For those who believed the dead followed scent, it was a double message. We remember you, and still we warn you away. Cattle, the axis upon which much of life revolved, were moved with ritual deliberateness. Herds were driven between fires, not hurried, but guided as if through a gate of heat. The smoke blew into their faces, and the flames licked the path. Old women and men touched hides as the beasts passed, pulling at tufts of hair and ritually examining marks as one might read a page. What did this achieve? On the surface, it was precaution, a chance to separate the weak from the strong, to mark for the winter those animals that would live and those that would be salted and stored. But it was also augury, the behavior of cattle before and during the passage, a bellow, a refusal to cross, a sudden weakness, was read as omen. A beast that balked might be spared out of sorrow or set apart as an offering. A brisk, untroubled passage suggested favor, strength that would pay the household in meat and milk. The old language of animal and omen lived in these small acts. The herd was not only an asset, but a text to be read. There were gestures at greater cost. In some places, a beast singled out by the crowd was sacrificed in a careful, ceremonial fashion. The word sacrifice should not be flattened into horror or romance. It had a pragmatic edge. The slaughtered animal fed families through months of cold, but the act of killing in the presence of the community was itself a contract. Blood poured into the soil or offered near the fire was a payment, whether to the earth, to the household's ancestors, or to that less tangible ledger of favors owed to powers one could not name. When blood was spilt, it was done with attention to boundaries. The place where meat was cut was marked, prayers or curses might be spoken, and the bones were treated with ritual specificity. The smallest care turned what might otherwise be only butchery into a public statement. We accept the winter, and we return what the night demands. Yet not every exchange was heavy with blood. Many gestures were symbolic, cunning in their simplicity. Bowls of porridge or halves of apple were set at thresholds. Coals were scattered to draw the fingers of the night toward food instead of flesh. In some households, small tokens, gifts of bread wrapped in cloth, were left for passing spirits, anonymous bribes meant to soothe curiosity. Where a neighborhood felt the old pressure of the hollow hills, these tiny offerings were left on stone and on sills, a small diplomacy enacted quietly when the village slept.
And then there was the sound, the deliberate cacophony that filled gaps the fire did not reach. Drums and horns and the banging of iron were joined by human voices raised to a level that banished sleep. Children were made loud on purpose, their giggles sharpened into shrill calls. Adults mimicked the clang of armor, the creak of the plow, the sounds of ordinary life amplified into rites. There is an old belief threaded through many different cultures. Spirits prefer silence and secrecy. They find loudness disconcerting. By making not merely noise but a sustained communal assault of sound, the villages sought to make themselves a difficult presence, too conspicuous, too troublesome, too alive for those who wanted the soft quiet of the mounds. The rhythm of the night had a cadence to it, noise, then silence, fire, then smoke, a passage of beasts, then offerings laid down. It was ritualized, not chaotic. People moved in patterns that had memory in them. Their hands performed sequences that echoed what had been done by others before. Even the simplest actions, setting a bowl or rubbing ash across a door, were tied to a larger logic. Keep the household intact by recognizing the world beyond and by offering that world a language it understood. This language included masks. Faces were hidden beneath rough cloth and painted soot, too crude to be merely disguise. Guising, the walking of the streets by those who intended to blur self and other, was an odd mixture of mimicry and obfuscation. Sometimes it was a form of bargaining. If spirits could not tell the living from the dead, they might pass by without harm. Sometimes it was social. Neighbors visited neighbors under the cover of masks to exchange food, to test alliances, to reconcile debts. The act of impersonation was itself a type of ritual, to confuse and to survive. In the guise of someone else, you might be granted mercy. In the absence of a clear self, the spirits might shrug. Beneath the practical, beneath the noise and the careful sacrifice lay the oldest belief. Fire and smoke shaped the border between worlds. The communal blaze was not simply for the living, it was a signal to every being that the village had claimed its rights for the winter. Yet signal is a two-sided thing. A light that announces can also beckon. The great fire drew together 100 human hearts. At the same time, it cast long, leaping shadows that fell beyond the circle and pooled in the dips where the mounds lay. Those shadows were not passive absence. They moved and pooled like water, and for some who watched, they were the first visible hint of other motion. Figures briefly whole, then gone. A glint, a hoof perhaps, as something passed on the far ridge.
This danger was understood even as the rites persisted. Fire holds and reveals. It also outlines what it cannot consume. It turns the night into a theater where shapes become legible. To keep the fire was to make the boundary crisp, to carve the world into those included and those excluded. But every boundary announces a borderland, and borderlands invite crossing. As embers sank and the torches faded into night, the villagers felt the change in the air. The noise softened, the cattle returned, stamped and bleary-eyed, the offerings gone or taken. People retreated inward, tucking the remembered warmth beneath blankets and into stories. Yet not all returned so simply. A few came home with a faint smear on their hands, ash perhaps, or a scent that would not wash away. Others spoke of a sudden hush on the road where seconds before there had been the clamor of passage. Some noticed that a bowl was empty in the morning they swore they had filled. These small anomalies were absorbed into cautionary tales, turned into rules to be obeyed in years to come. What the bonfire achieved was twofold. It bound the village to itself with light and sound. It carved a perimeter of human agency against a long, indifferent dark. But in doing so, it admitted the presence of what it kept at bay. Where flame sears, it draws attention. Where smoke rises, it maps a path. The ritual acknowledged that other wills watched the village, that the living had debt and duty beyond mere survival. Fire was both ward and beacon, protector and provocation. When the last of the torches had guttered and the drums had ceased their rhythm, the villagers did not celebrate success so much as exhale with the vigilance that would not end at dawn. They understood, in the tightness of breath and the fingerline of ash on a lintel, that they had done what was required. They had named their boundaries, fed their debts, and made enough noise to make the night uneasy. But they also knew, with a certainty that did not comfort, that some things, once rousted by flame and song, did not settle back into silence. They had been watched, and in watching, the watchers had been seen.
When the flames sank low and the last torch smoke curled into the hollow, the hills did not only lay quiet, they listened. In that listening, the world beyond the hearth made itself known, not as a single thing, but as many. A chorus of claims and grievances older than a household ledger. The people called these presences by names that changed with the tongue and the parish. The best known were the Ishi, the hidden folk, but beneath that umbrella lived entire economies of fear and courtesy. The Sluagh, the restless host, the Puka, the shapeshifter, the Dullahan, the rider without a face, the Bean-Shi, whose cry folded into the bones of a family, and the Kailach, the ancient crone who kept the weather and the winter's tally. The Ishi were not merely spirits in the thin, romantic sense. They were the land's other claim on those who lived upon it, a parallel tenancy that kept its own rules. They dwelt in mounds of earth that dotted the countryside, low crescents and hummocks that by daylight might be mistaken for nothing more than hummocks of turf or collapsed barrows. At night, though, those mounds breathed. People felt it as a pressure in the air, a slight lift in the scalp, as if something recognized you by an old, exacting rite. To stumble across a mound on Samhain was to trespass on a household that was not yours. The etiquette for such trespass was strict. Leave a small portion of your meal at the edge of the field. Do not whistle, do not pick flowers, and above all, do not laugh too loud, for joy was a blade that cut both ways. The Sluagh came like a cloud. Not all remembered them with the same name. In some valleys they were simply the host, in others the dead's riding. But their manner was consistent, a moving mass of intent, winged and cold, that sought the last sighs. Old women spoke of hearing them first as a sound like distant wolves, then as a thrum in the bones, then as a blackness that passed over the moon. They were not content to merely haunt the margins. They took and carried. A dying man's breath might be borne on their backs to some other place. A house too near a mound might wake one morning without an animal or a child it had the night before. For communities, the Sluagh represented a calculus of risk. Not all hosts were malevolent, but the restless were swift and indifferent, and to meet them was to be involved in an economy of loss you could not always control. Then there was the Puka, a spirit less interested in dragging souls than in unsettlement. He arrived as a horse with a mane like kelp, or as a shaggy dog that moved with a human gait. Sometimes he took the shape of a man with too many teeth in the bowl of his cheek. The Puka liked edges, the lip of the ford, the hedge between fields, the moor's hollow where mist gathered. He rewarded the daring with strange luck. A rider who held on without screaming might find silver in the saddlebag in the morning, but he punished vanity and cruelty without hesitation. The Puka's tricks were not always theatrical. He would show you the path home and then turn it inside out. He would switch a child's name in the mouth of a mother and watch the ripple of confusion. He would mimic a neighbor's cough until a quarrel drifted into violence. His presence was a lesson. The world beyond the fire had a sense of humor that could be cruel.
The Dullahan rode differently. He carried his head beneath his arm, or, in some tellings, rode with the head tucked against his chest, the eyes fixed on the world as if they had no lids. His whip was said to be a human spine. The snap of it was the sound of a year closing. To see the Dullahan was to see death as a sovereign. Where he paused, a town knew the taking was soon. Mothers covered their faces, dogs howled. The inevitable paperwork of mourning began its slow crawl even before the first body fell cold. Yet even the Dullahan obeyed rules. If you turned a mirror to the road, some said, he could not bear his own sight and would ride past. And if you greeted him by name and offered a cup, he might tip the cup with the same steadiness with which he tipped the scales of life. Such concessions were not moral softness, but practical negotiation, a sharp recognition that even sovereign figures of ruin could be bargained with if one remembered the proper words. The Banshee, the Banshee, lived in a different registry of terror. She did not arrive to take, she arrived to announce. Her cry was not a random wail, but a kin sign, a voice shaped by sorrow and by the fine grain of family ties. To hear her was to know, with the bones' certainty, that a house would soon be visited by grief. She was private, intimate, attuned to lineage in a way the Sluagh were not. Families had stories of an old woman in ragged linen who appeared by a window, or of a hairline keening at the edge of a river. The Banshee's function was a terrible courtesy, to give warning, to unmoor the worst surprise a household might endure, so that prayers might be met and the last rites prepared. And overarching them all, when winter tightened its hand, stood the Cailleach. She was not a single figure so much as a season-made person. Sometimes she was a crone with knotted hair. Sometimes she wore the shape of the mountain itself. The Cailleach counted nights.
She was the weaver of frost and the keeper of the streams that would freeze beneath the moon. To offend her, by taking more peat than your allotment, by stealing a ram in her time, risked a winter without thaw. Sacrifices to the Cailleach were not melodramatic, they were pragmatic. A clump of hair on a stone, a cup of milk poured at dawn, a small, precise offering of an egg or an oat roll pressed like a pact into the ground. A household could not hope to rival her power, but it could acknowledge it, and in that acknowledgement find a kind of protection. These spirits were not uniformly wicked nor uniformly benign. They occupied moral spaces that often frustrated simple distinction. The hidden folk might reward filial piety with prosperity and punish neglect with madness. The Sluagh might carry a madman away and thus spare the village further harm. The Púca's mischief sometimes corrected arrogance in leaders. The Dullahan's adjudications were absolute, but not capricious. The Banshee's wail, while terrifying, allowed preparation. To call them monsters was to miss the complexity of a world where spiritual activity was bound into social function.
Communities developed their own languages of negotiation. In some townlands, elders recited genealogies aloud through the night, naming each household's dead in careful cadence. The belief was that a long list of names made the dead's claims legible and less greedy. In other places, iron was kept close. A horse's bridle, a plowshare, for iron's sharpness was thought to irritate the hidden folk. Rowan twigs were nailed above doors as a stubborn ward. Salt was sprinkled in corners to confuse a spirit's sense of direction. Bells were tied to children's necks so that the jingling might keep an otherwise tender soul from slipping into the wrong hand. Where a child was thought stolen, the household might set a mirror by the cradle for 3 nights, or leave a bowl of milk by the threshold with a pinch of rowan leaf. Small, repetitive tasks that said, with both defiance and fear, "We will not yield you easily." There were also more cunning measures. Guising, dressing as something other than oneself, tricked the observant. If a spirit could not place your face, could not decide whether you are kin or midden, it might pass. Some families practiced the odd reversal. They turned their coats inside out, spoke the child's name backwards, or left a man-sized log in the cradle to fool the fief. Others negotiated more formally. A dish of the evening's meal left on the doorstep. A chair by the hearth reserved in honor of an ancestor. A prayer muttered toward the mound. Bargain and bribe existed side by side with coercion. Sometimes a household left a portion of meat near a mound, and in return believed that the cattle would be less likely to wander or be taken. Variance abounded. In a coastal parish, the Púca might have the salt-sweet smell of seaweed. In mountain hollows, the Sluagh were said to rattle like pebbles in a bag. Names changed with dialect and worry. In one place name, the she were called the Quiet People. In another, they were the Lords of the Little Hill. But the pattern remained. The world beyond the gate had interests, and those interests intersected with the year's needs.
These were not merely superstitions to be mocked by later rational minds. They were systems of social practice forged in a precarious environment. To leave a loaf of bread at the doorway was to bind together memory, food security, and spiritual diplomacy. To keep a bell at a child's throat was to convert fear into a manageable rhythm. The rites balanced loss against safety. They folded the unknown into routines heavy with repetition, so that the fragile order of life might withstand the pressure of a winter when the living had so little else to hold. And still, even with these precautions, something else lingered. the truth that no amount of salt or rattle could erase. The spirits were not only names in a ledger, they were witnesses. They remembered slights and bargains forgotten by the living. They could be amused by your cleverness or hard as frost if you made a mistake. The folk of the night held a long memory. The memory of lands taken, of kin lost, of bargains made and broken across generations. To meet them required respect, yes, but also humility. For in a world where the Hollow Hills kept their own company, every human act became an act of diplomacy, a small, sharp negotiation with forces that could not be controlled, only courted. Spirits were named, and once named, the ways of living with them multiplied. Next, we will follow those ways, the offerings, the bargains, the tricks, into the private rooms where households kept their secrets, and the small altars where the living tried, night after cold night, to keep the balance.
Spirits were named, and once named, the household knew it must answer. When Samhain approached, the hearth became a kind of courtroom. The family's small room, low-ceilinged, smoke-darkened, full of the scrap scent of last year's peat, rearranged itself into a place of reception. Chairs were pushed closer to the embers. The table's edge was cleared as if for a body that might never arrive. There was a practiced slowness to these movements, as if each stroke of the hand might wake something listening within the timber. Food was prepared with the same deliberation as any legal pact. Bowls of porridge, a sectioned loaf, an apple split and pressed against a plate, the leftover crusts wrapped in linen. Everything set out for an unseen guest was at once humility and calculation. An extra place was a small geometry of belief. It could be a stool pulled from the corner, or a wooden trencher leaned against a plate, its surface rubbed smooth by generations of palms. Families left a spoon upon the dish as though inviting fingers to close around it. The portion was never extravagant. Showing abundance risked false provocation, but stinginess risked offense. The offering served three purposes. It recognized the ancestor, it fed the passing stranger, and it performed a contract in plain sight. In some houses, the seat remained empty by choice. In others, it was a deliberate ruse, a seat that appeared occupied so that a hungry spirit might pass on, satisfied by the illusion of company. Soul cakes were the votive currency of the night. Small, dense, and sugarless to our modern taste, they were more bread than dessert. Rounds of oat and barley, sometimes studded with currants, sometimes pressed with a cross of ash on their brow. A child might be given such a cake to carry to the doorstep, to place there with a whispered name. The cakes were not mere food, they were identification tokens. In a world where the dead could mistake the living and the living could mistake the dead, the soul cake said plainly, "We remember you. We have not forgotten your place at the table." Where a bowl was emptied by morning, some families read it as a blessing. Where it remained untouched, they read danger. If offerings were the language of hospitality, Guising was the language of self-preservation. On Samhain night, the streets filled with figures whose faces were not their own. Men swapped cloaks, women wrapped shawls across their cheeks. Children wore the roughened faces of old masks cut from bark and charcoal. The practice had many meanings. There was the practical, almost legal logic. If a spirit could not place you, if you were a moving outline without a name, it might ignore you. There was also a social calculus at play. Neighbors used guising to cross thresholds they might otherwise not, to test alliances, to ask favors in the guise of jest. A man disguised as a beggar might receive soup and in turn confess a grievance or settle a debt under the cloak of anonymity.
The mask dissolved the ordinary rules for a night, allowing negotiation under cover. Mumming was an intimate mode of this disguise. Groups moved door to door, performing a small and often grotesque turnaround of identity. A man would play the wife, a woman the fool. The acts were not merely entertainment. They enacted deeper truths about reciprocity and humiliation, about who might be allowed to speak in a community and who must listen. A well-executed mumming could soften a grudge or call out an offense. A failed one could inflame it. In some tales, the mummers were careful to mimic precisely the dead, the way an ancestor walked, the cadence of an old cough, because imitation acted as homage and sometimes as bribe. This was a complex barter. The household left food with one hand and took stories with the other. A visitor might offer a tale about a distant cousin's fortune in exchange for a bowl of stew. A masked child could be paid with a cake and reveal in return a whispered warning about a neighbor's lost goat. The night permitted commerce of the strange sort. The currency was memory and attention as much as meat and grain. To receive a visitor in disguise was to accept, for a moment, the erasure of the fixed self, and to place your household under the care or the test of someone else. But this diplomacy was thin and dangerous. To bargain with the dead or with those who answered their call was to engage in moral sleight of hand. What did a family owe an ancestor who had been cruel in life? What of a poor neighbor whose name the household begrudged? The offering smoothed some edges, but could not erase histories. There are stories told late beside the embers of food left at the threshold that vanished, and of peace that failed to follow. A child might be found pale and trembling at dawn, claiming a thing with cold fingers had sat at the table. An old man might notice the cattle had shifted in count. The bargains were not always equitable. Sometimes the living found that their gifts had only whetted appetites. Some households practiced anonymous giving as a form of legal contingency. Pots of porridge were left at crossroads, anonymous and unblessed, so the spirits who took them could not be tied back to a particular family wronged in life. At times, baskets were left with no name, and the giver would walk away without looking back, an act meant to avoid the reciprocity that names demand. The anonymous offering was moral insurance. Give, but do not claim the return on your ledger. Avoid owing the dead an explanation. In other cases, families left small prayers tucked under the plate or a sprig of rowan laid near the food, a soft writing that said, "We ask only enough." The ethics of these gestures were ambiguous. There were communities where leaving too many offerings was considered dangerous, an insult in its flattery, an invitation to greed. Elsewhere, stinginess was read as a kind of cruelty that could draw the attention of the very things one hoped to appease. To read these choices as mere superstition is to miss their function. They were social devices, ways of distributing risk across a network. A poor household that shared its last bit of barley with the road might, in the communal imagination, gain protection because its generosity affirmed a social fabric. A rich family that refused to leave even a crust might find itself alone and watched. Yet the most cunning of all practices was the trick. Disguise could be more than protection, it could be strategy. If spirits were thought to take those out of place, children, the curious, those who lingered, then to confuse the spirit's recognition was to reroute danger. Parents learned to call a child by a false name into the night, or to hang the child's swaddling cloth outside the door for 3 nights so that a spirit might be satisfied with the cloth's presence and not reach for the sleeping body. In one often repeated story, a woman discovered that her infant had been spared because she had placed a wooden effigy in the crib, a crude substitute that fooled whatever had been searching.
these measures had something of the legal trick. In the absence of certainty, present convincing proof. There were also allegations of a darker commerce. Some households, desperate or covetous, were said to have struck more dangerous bargains. A child given to the Hollow in exchange for a season of prosperity. A secret loaf left with a name scratched into it that implied a debt beyond the visible. Whether these tales were literal or moral fictions, they served to mark the limits of acceptable exchange. They warned that bargaining with the dead could transgress into the sacrificial, and that what was given in desperation might cost more than winter bread. The night's small rituals carried one more power. They transformed domestic space into a mirror for community memory. When a family left a chair empty, they were not merely invoking the dead as individuals, they were affirming lineage, claiming a continuity that extended beyond hunger and frost. The actions of guising and offering wove the household into a larger story, a story that spoke of land, of theft and settlement, of favors owed and favors remembered. To perform these rites was to participate in a living archive, a repeated act that kept records not in paper, but in practice and in the bones of the village. And yet, even as they bartered for safety and belonging, curiosity stirred in others. The offerings and the masks were a form of conversation, and some wanted more than a bargain. They wanted answers. They watched the bowl beside the door, not simply to see if it would be emptied, but to test what manner of being would take it. They stood upon the threshold, guised or not, to listen for the particular cadence of a banshee's cry or the distant thrum of the Sluagh's wings. For where hospitality touched mystery, the appetite for knowledge grew. The household met the night, but the curious sought more than protection. They sought knowledge.
And on Samhain night, knowledge was a dangerous thing. The fire that had burned high in the village square was now a mere amber glow, a low heart beating in ash. The air held that sharp, metallic chill particular to a night when the veil was said to thin. Some people drew their children close, bolting doors, feeding the dead with offerings of bread and song. But others, quieter, less content with what the living already knew, went out. They walked beyond the circle of firelight to where still water pooled and shadows stretched into something that resembled corridors. These were the seekers, the questioners. And on this night of all nights, the world would sometimes answer back. Samhain was the hinge of the year, the moment when past and future pressed close, as though separated only by a thin breath on glass. Divination was not a festival trick. It was a summons, subtle, calculated, and often perilous. Apples were the most common beginning. Their skin was crisp, their taste sharp as cold air, and they were bound to stories of fertility, love, and the passage between worlds. In some places, a girl might peel an apple in a single spiral, cast the ribbon over her shoulder, and watch the letter it formed upon the ground. That letter, they said, belonged to the name of the one she would marry. A simple act, but behind the superstition was an older logic. The apple, with its five-pointed star hidden in its core, was a fruit of thresholds. But the deeper rituals were not so innocent. Some crept out to still ponds with a candle cupped in their hands. There they lowered apples into the dark, watching their drift upon the mirrored surface. If two apples moved toward one another, the pair was destined to meet. If they turned away, a bond would never hold.
More daring seekers took the fruit between their teeth and leaned over the water, bobbing not as a game, but as a binding charm. To fall in at the wrong moment, it was whispered, meant the water would remember your name. Others turned to mirrors, small panes of polished metal or darkened glass held in a single hand. To gaze into a mirror on Samhain was to invite something to gaze back. Young women stood before the hearth with a taper candle, staring into the mirror's depth, hoping to catch a fleeting image of a future husband's face. But some swore they saw other things: eyes without bodies, faces long dead, figures standing just behind their shoulders. More than one such mirror was found cracked by morning, as though something inside had pressed against the surface and left. Bone and fire gave even darker readings. In some rural households, a sheep's shoulder blade was placed over glowing embers until it whitened like a ghost's tooth. Seers read the cracks that appeared in the bone like a map: lines for illness, shadows for death, smoothness for years of plenty. The practice, called scapulinancy, was said to demand silence. If anyone spoke, the spirit guiding the fracture would twist the message into lies. It was a quiet, intense art, often performed in corners where the light barely reached. More than one family had stories of a bone that burned too black and of the season of famine that followed. The ogham stones, carved with the slanted lines of an older tongue, were drawn from pouches and thrown upon linen. The seer, sometimes a wandering wise woman, sometimes a nervous youth, interpreted the patterns with the care of one stepping between thorns. Each mark corresponded to trees, seasons, warnings. Birch could promise new beginnings. Ash could signal strife. Yew, the tree of death, was never a welcome sign on this night. It was said the ogham did not merely reveal, but remembered. If a question was asked in bad faith, the stones would reflect it back with cruelty.
Water was another mirror. A basin set on the threshold, filled before sunset, could become a portal for vision. Some stared into it until faces surfaced like oil blooming on a pond. Others dropped nuts or leaves onto the surface, whispering questions about journeys, crops, or the health of kin. The reflection was thought to carry the reply, but it was also thought to attract. More than one cautionary tale told of a girl who saw her dead brother's hand breaking the surface of the basin, or of a boy who swore the water whispered back his name with someone else's breath. But the most dangerous rites belonged to those who called the dead. Necromancy at Samhain was not the grand theatrical sorcery of later stories. It was precise, quiet, almost bureaucratic in its terror. In some traditions, the seer sat with a single candle, calling the name of the deceased 3 times. In others, they lay down with their head upon a grave mound, waiting for dreams to open their inner ear. The dead were not compelled so much as invited, coaxed through offerings of milk, wine, or whispered names. They came as echoes, as feelings, as sudden shifts in air. If the invitation was clean, answers came in signs: a knocking on the wall, the snuffing of a candle, a voice barely audible but unmistakably known. If the invitation was careless, something else might answer instead. Local histories held their warnings. There are accounts of a widow in Munster who sought to speak to her husband. The neighbors found her the next morning, seated at her table, eyes open and blind, her hands pressed against the empty mirror. Another tale speaks of a seer who drew a circle of ash to bind what he called up, but forgot to step inside before the name was spoken. His footprints, they said, ended at the edge of the grove and were never seen again. These were not stories told to frighten children,
but cautionary records carried through generations like legal precedents. There were rules whispered in every village. Never look too long into the mirror. Never ask a question whose answer you cannot bear. Never call a name twice if the first time something else answers. Never, under any circumstances, thank the dead, for thanks is a promise. Divination was not seen as entertainment, but as an act of threshold crossing. Those who practiced it understood, or thought they did, that to seek knowledge was to bargain with something hungry for attention, and sometimes the knowledge given was not a gift, but a hook. Samhain nights were filled with these quiet tests of fate. Apples, mirrors, bones, water, the whispered names of the dead, each a key turning in a lock between worlds. And when secrets are spoken into the hollow of night, something always listens. Divination promised secrets of blood and fate, and where secrets are told, bargains follow.
On Samhain, those bargains were often written not in ink, but in flesh. When the lamps were banked and the great fire had done its work, another economy awakened. The year's calculus required a crucible, an accounting of living things to be carried through winter. In a landscape where grain would sour and pastures shrink, survival depended on making hard, communal choices. Those choices were practical, brutal, and ritualized. And in their doing, they wrote social order onto bodies. The morning after the last turn of the harvest often smelled of iron. The air held a copper tang, and the ground around the communal hearths bore the faint, dark stains of where animals had been steadied and readied. Slaughter was not a private affair. It was public, communal, a shared violence that bound people together through necessity and obligation. A beast brought down at Samhain served households for weeks. Its meat salted and smoked, its fat rendered for lamps, its bones cracked for soup and for tools. Nothing was wasted. Yet the act of killing was also theater, deliberate, governed by custom, observed by the whole village as if the season itself required a witness. The ritual began with selection. Which animals would be kept and which would be offered. The old judgment fell to elders and to those who held communal authority, the chieftain, the steward, the head of the household. Selection was practical. The weak or the excessive might be chosen, but it was also symbolic. Choosing which bull or ewe to put to the knife was to assert a claim on the future, which bloodlines would continue, which would feed the living. In some districts, the selection itself was framed as augury. A beast's behavior, the feel of its hide, the direction of its eyes as it passed between torches, all these were read for omen. A beast that refused to cross a line of flame might be spared as an object of pity or taken as a token for the mound. A thrifty, eager animal might be prized and kept. The slaughter was a ritual of boundaries. Performed near the communal fire, it made explicit the exchange being made. Life for community, flesh for shelter. The knife's edge was not merely an instrument of butchery, but a tool that completed a contract. Blood might be allowed to run to the soil, where by some accounts it was offered back to the land as payment. In others, it was collected and poured into vessels or marked upon doorposts. Such gestures declared that the household recognized obligations that reached beyond the living, to ancestors, to the earth, to whatever claims the hollow hills might press.
There was ceremony in the cut. Men who took the knife moved with practiced slowness. No excess noise, no frivolous jests. Even the youngest were told to look away until the right moment. The act required reverence. When the animal fell, a kind of hush followed, a communal exhale. Then the work began: flaying, dividing, salting. Where bones were treated as relics, the community tended them with near-sacred care. The marrow bone might be set aside, the skull washed and hung in a place of honor, or buried in a special cache. These bones were not mere refuse. They were testimony, records of who had fed whom, who had been spared, who had been given back. Feasting followed, but it was not simply gluttony in celebration. The Samhain feast was a public ledger made edible. Portions were apportioned according to rank and obligation. The Lord's table and the poor man's trench were both supplied, but with attention to balance. Those who had more in the summer were expected to give in the autumn. Redistribution was social insurance. A family thrust toward hardship by misfortune was given meat and grain. In return, they offered labor in spring or pledged fealty. The feast was thus a contract renewed. The community would take care of its own if each household did its part. In this light, the slaughter was a governance mechanism as much as a necessity. Yet there were darker turns to these acts. The rituals of slaughter could, and sometimes did, become a place where social tension was enacted and adjudicated. Blood in public clarified status: who could afford to spare an animal, who could not, who could host a feast, who begged at the threshold. In times of strain, the rite could be a theater of accusation. If a household refused to share, rumor would mount like smoke. A curt answer, a withheld portion, might be interpreted not as thrift but as malice. In some stories, the slighted villagers would mark the offender at the next Samhain, leaving a bitter token at his gate. In this way, the ritual kept a moral ledger, a visible record of reciprocity and its breach. There was room, too, for formalized sacrifice. Not every region practiced blood offering in the same way, but where it occurred, it carried weight. A beast given at the hearth might be dedicated in the name of an ancestor, its first cuts offered toward a mound or to a shrine. In such acts, the slaughter took on a communal apology of sorts. We give up our best so that the household stands. For some, sacrifice was defensive, offering to the hollow to avert theft of children or cattle. For others, it was propitiation, a necessary tribute that, it was believed, would pay back in calms and in favors through winter. Remembrance threaded these acts tightly to lineage. Meat laid out at tables that night might be set aside for a particular ancestor, or a portion burned on the coals with a prayer. Families who had suffered violent loss made these offerings as a way of keeping their dead present without letting them rule. In that grain of burnt fat, or in the clean white of a bone placed beneath a bench, lay the memory of lost kin, not merely as grief, but as ongoing obligation. The dead were both debtor and creditor in this economy.
And where there were obligations, there could be coercion. Tales persisted of households that traded beyond the pale, of bargains struck that demanded a child's service in return for a season of prosperity, of tokens given beneath blankets that implied future claims. Whether these stories were literal or moral exempla, they functioned as warnings. Contracts with hidden costs were to be feared. The ledger could be kept in ink, or it could be kept in flesh. In times of extreme want, rumors tell of people who were willing to bargain away kin out of desperation. Such tales were told to enforce a boundary. Some payments are immoral, even under famine. The communal slaughter also enforced norms of reparation and law. When a man's cattle were stolen, the taking at Samhain became a moment of reckoning, Restitution might be exacted in meat, or public shaming might follow at the feast. The ritual stage of slaughter made grievances visible, and the community could settle claims within the social ritual itself rather than allow vendettas to fester. In this way, the night's violence contained within it a civilizing logic. Violence acknowledged and ritualized could be channeled into order rather than into endless reprisal. Yet the sight of blood and the memory of the ledger left a residue. Children who watched the cutting learned the range of what might be done in a crisis. Elders who had seen too many winters told stories that turned cautionary. The bones hung in caches gave a certain gravity to the household's memory. You could read a family's history by the way they treated their waste. It was a stern pedagogy. Life was finite, and to survive, you must be willing to commit something of value into the communal pot. By the time the church began to press into these lands, these practices did not vanish overnight. They shifted. Some rites were folded into Christian pages. Feasts became saints' days. Masses accompanied memorial offerings. Other practices receded into the margins, performed furtively in barns, whispered in the night. Clerical condemnation called some acts pagan. At the same time, Christian ritual offered a new vocabulary for sacrifice and remembrance that the lay populace could adapt. Yet the ledger, once written into the bones of the village, persisted even as the language changed. When priests renamed bonfires and consecrated bread, they did not erase the memory of the iron scent in the air, or the way neighbors had once counted beasts by torchlight. The ledger of flesh had done its work. It had structured obligations, it had taught reciprocity, and it had recorded the cost of survival. But as winter came down harder and ecclesiastical authority grew firmer, the public geometry of slaughter and its open bargains would be condemned, hidden, or transformed. The old visibility of the act, the communal cutting, the bones' testimony, would increasingly find ways to live in shadow. From the silence after the knife, the story of adaptation begins. The rituals would change shape as a different set of powers demanded their own records and rites, and the old ledger would be read anew under new inks.
By the 9th century, the church had turned its gaze toward this night, not the way a farmer watches the turning of the seasons, but the way an authority watches a rival. Samhain was too deeply rooted to be erased. Its bonfires, its gatherings, its unspoken pacts with the unseen, they formed the spine of the year. So the church did what power often does when it cannot crush something. It named it. All Hallows Eve, the vigil of all saints, a night not of wandering spirits and dark thresholds, but of saintly memory and holy intercession. On parchment, the season was reborn as Christian time. In the fields and hearths of the common folk, however, the change was less absolute. What had been the festival of the hollow hills was now wrapped in Latin prayers and the slow tolling of church bells. The fire burned the same, only the words around it changed. The church's strategy was both cunning and fragile. By dedicating the night to saints, by promising a Christian afterlife in place of the other world, they hoped to sever the old roots of seasonal magic. The dead would no longer walk, they would be prayed for. The bonfire became the hallow fire, blessed with holy water, its embers carried home as sanctified rather than liminal. Yet beneath this surface, memory lingered like embers under ash. The people knew which night it truly was. In some places, the priests stood beside the villagers as they lit their fires, sprinkling salt and water, reciting blessings to overwrite the old songs. But others, sterner, less patient, thundered from their pulpits. They spoke of demons in the fog, of pagan rites in the shadows, of souls ensnared by the hollow folk. What the villagers saw as reverence for the dead, the priests called superstition. And so Samhain slipped underground.
The old rites did not die. They were folded into Christian garments, wearing masks of sanctity. The setting of a place at the table for the dead became a prayer for the souls in purgatory. Bonfires became parish vigils. The food left at thresholds, now explained as alms for the poor, carried older echoes of unseen guests. Geysers and maskers were tolerated in some regions, demonized in others. Every prayer spoke two languages at once, the one the church wrote and the one the people remembered.
But not all practices could be disguised. Divination at the threshold, midnight mirror rites, whispered bargains at old burial mounds, these were harder to baptize. They lived in barns, in hedgerows, in places where the priest's gaze faltered. The church saw in these acts not harmless custom, but competition. If souls could speak on Samhain night, then saints might not be the only intercessors. If fires could keep spirits at bay, then holy relics were not alone in their power. And so, what could not be absorbed was condemned. By the late Middle Ages, this tension became persecution. What once were household rites were now whispered about as witchcraft. Women who knew the old words to keep a spirit from entering the door were called cunning folk, and then accused of consorting with demons. Men who lit fires on the hilltops without permission were said to call not ancestors, but infernal hosts. The church had named the darkness, yes, but it had also created a boundary, and where there are boundaries, there are those who cross them. Records from inquisitorial sermons tell us of priests warning their flocks to turn away from the bonfire, to remain inside on All Hallows Eve, and to pray rather than roam. But the countryside had long memories. Families still slipped bread and milk onto window ledges, muttered charms over threshold stones, or whispered names of their dead as the wind shifted. It was not open defiance. It was something quieter, survival of memory beneath a veneer of piety. And so a double night emerged, one visible, official, with candles in church windows and the recitation of litanies, and another, hidden, older, a night where the wind itself seemed to speak, where the Ishi were still believed to wander, and where the bonfire still marked the edge between the living and the dead. The villagers understood what the church did not, that renaming does not unmake. A season this ancient does not disappear. It waits.
The tension between what was declared sacred and what was feared persisted for centuries. And in time, the language of the church began to absorb the language of its rival. The hollow hosts became demons. The spirits of the mounds became devils in disguise. The dead who returned were not beloved kin, but restless souls who had failed in their penance. In this way, the church both overwrote and preserved the old stories, preserving them by condemning them. It was from this alchemy of fear and memory that the image of the witch's Sabbath began to take shape. To some clerics, every flickering hilltop fire was a diabolical gathering, every mummer's mask a mockery of the saints.
Accusations spread like frost, and as they did, old Samhain customs, long woven into the fabric of rural life, were transformed into evidence. A loaf of bread left for wandering souls became proof of heresy. A charm whispered against the Sluagh became a pact with hell. Yet even as the church built its walls, it could not keep the wind from slipping through the cracks. The old stories found refuge in places too small for authority to reach. In lullabies, in winter tales, in the way a child was warned not to open the door after nightfall. And as centuries turned, the saint's night and the spirit's night fused into something neither church nor folk fully controlled. A threshold wearing two masks. The night of saints gave new names to old shadows, but the old hunger, the sense that something moves beneath the thin veil of autumn, never left. And in whispered stories, beneath the toll of the bells, the hollow hosts still marched.
It is here, in the damp soil of local memory, that the most persistent fragments of Samhain remain. Not in books, but in the way a door is shut at dusk, or how the wind is listened to rather than ignored. These were not grand legends told before courts or scribes. These were stories carried in low voices, from kitchen to kitchen, from one winter to the next. Let us wander into them now, into the places where the hollow hills still speak. The Banshee's Lament, County Clare, 1842. It was said that the O'Daly family had always been marked. For 3 generations, no death came to them unannounced. It came with a cry, not the wail of a living woman, but something thinner, sharper, as if a grief too old for flesh had learned to sing. On the last night of October, the eldest daughter, Eilis, heard it while fetching water from the well, a sound neither near nor far, as though the fog itself had found a voice. She froze. The sound rose again, long, keening, splitting the stillness between the hills. The cattle stirred in their pens, stamping nervously. The water in her bucket rippled without wind. She dropped it and ran, but she already knew. By morning, her father was dead in his bed, his breath having stopped between 1 hour and the next. The villagers said the Banshee had walked the hedgerows that night. Some swore they saw her at the edge of the bog, a figure with hair like winter mist, combing it with a bone-white hand. No one dared follow. They didn't need to. When the Banshee sings, it is already decided.
The Sluagh at Ballinahone, Galway, 1897. Patrick Mulrennan was a stubborn man. He had no patience for the old stories. He said that the dead were dead and that only the wind moved through the hills. That year, as the harvest ended, he refused to bar his door or light a fire. While the rest of the village gathered around their hearths, Patrick stood in the doorway with a lantern, staring into the dark fields like a man daring the night to blink first. Around midnight, the wind changed. It came low, not like a storm, but like breath dragging along the ground. The cattle moaned. The dog bolted under the table. Then he heard it, the faint beating of wings. Not bird wings, something larger, heavier, folding and unfolding in the blackness. A shape moved along the road, not walking, not flying, but gliding, as if the night itself had grown limbs. Patrick's lantern died. The door slammed shut behind him, though no one was inside to move it. He was found the next morning, face down in the dirt, his lips black with cold, though the night had not frozen. They buried him with the sign of the cross, but the old women whispered, the Sluagh had taken him. It is said that even the priest would not pass that road on Samhain night again.
The Mummers of Armagh, 1765. Not all stories end with the dead. Some end with the living pretending to be them. In the parish of Armagh, a group of young men set out on Samhain night wearing rags, masks of painted burlap, and animal skulls. They called it guising, harmless mischief, they said. But the old man at the edge of the village warned them, when you wear a dead thing's face, something else may answer. They went anyway. Through the fields, laughing, they knocked on doors, begged for cakes, and frightened children. Then a fog came rolling down from the hills. One of them, Kieran, turned to joke, but the figure beside him didn't laugh. The mask was wrong. Too pale, its antlers dripped. And when the fog lifted, Kieran was gone. The others claimed they heard a laugh that didn't belong to any of them. For years after, the village banned guising on that night. But mothers still warned their sons, never wear the skull too long, because sometimes it's not just you behind it. The Girl Who Looked into the Water, Tipperary, 1811. Aithne was 17 when she tried the water mirror, a basin filled at the liminal hour just before midnight. She wanted to see the face of the man she would marry. Her friends urged her on. She struck the match, lit the candle, and leaned over the surface. The house was silent, except for the faint creak of beams and the drip of water outside. They say she saw something, not a face she loved, but a shadow that stretched too long, moving before she did. She screamed, but when her friends rushed in, the water was black as ink. Aithne never spoke again of what she saw. She married no one, and on every Samhain after, she placed the basin on the table, filled it, and turned away without looking in. These are not grand myths carved into stone. They are the quiet stories that survive where official histories cannot reach. They are warnings, shaped not by scribes, but by winter nights, when the mind listens harder than it should. The people who told them believed they were not imagining things. They were describing the rules of a world that ran parallel to their own. And if you listen closely, their stories still hum beneath the surface of autumn. The hills remember, the wind remembers. The saints may have claimed the night, but the hollow hills never gave it back. Stories speak with human tongues, but there are other witnesses, mute and enduring. Beneath the turf and stone, in charred bone and buried charms, the material traces of this night still whisper their own accounts.
The tales had teeth, and the hills held the echoes. But stories, however hungry, leave no fingerprints. The past that touched the present did so in things, in charcoal, in bone, in stone, objects that do not argue, only endure. If the hollow hills remembered, archaeology is the slow, stubborn ear that tries to listen. Walk with me, then, into peat and trench, where the material world keeps a quieter record of Samhain than any chronicler, and where the archaeologist's trowel reads grief, feast, and boundary in the same mark. First, fire made into deposit. In the hollows and the great mounds around ancient ritual centers, excavators have found arcs of burning, pits ringed with char and daubed with the remains of fuel, scorched peat, cracked pottery, and the scattered bones of animals. These are not simply hearths. Their scale and context suggest episodes of communal burning, repeated events that left deep, dark seams beneath turf and stone. The pattern is suggestive, not proof of Samhain, which the archaeologist whose cautious voice resists naming outright. But the archaeology fits what oral memory insists: a night of great fires, a public flame with embers taken and carried back into private life. Peat itself is a witness. Wetland deposits around settlements show layers of organic material interrupted by foreign objects. Peat bogs, those slow builders of time, have preserved more than plant matter. They hold pottery shards, ritual deposits, and sometimes whole offerings placed between summers, loaths, animal bones, even the rare human body. The chemistry of peat, acidic, low in oxygen, arrests decay and keeps the details other soils would eat. A cut mark on a bone, a charred grain, the alignment of a deposit. To walk the bog is to stand over a library of half-decayed pages, each one a fragile argument that people once placed things here on purpose. Feasting leaves a special signature. Across early medieval settlements and in some ritual contexts, archaeologists find concentrations of animal bone within hearth constructions and pits adjacent to meeting places. The species mix, sheep, pig, cattle, sometimes dog, the pattern of butchery, and the presence of high-value cuts all speak to communal meals rather than mere subsistence waste. When these deposits cluster near tombs or mounds, an interpretation suggests itself. Feasts shared with or in honor of the dead. Meals staged at thresholds where living and dead met. In the bones there is counting. Which households supplied meat? Which households received it? And which were singled out? These patterns support the old stories of tables set for absent faces and the communal sharing that Samhain required. Stones speak too, though they are hard-mouthed. Standing stones carved with ogam, the earliest written alphabet of Ireland, are often interpreted as boundary markers, memorials, or territorial claims. The incisions that name a person or a family set a landscape of rights and obligations into place. To mark a stone is to assert, this land answers to us, this mound carries our dead. Where ogam stones cluster near barrows or ring forts, the archaeological reading is of a landscape where memory, law, and land overlap. A marked stone can be read not only as inscription, but as a public message. Do not trespass. This place keeps accounts.
But archaeology is not a ledger that hands us receipts. It is a method of careful inference. A charred pit might be a hearth, a ritual bonfire, or the remnant of a cooking event gone large. Bones in a ditch might be the remains of a feast, a pestilence disposal, or the aftermath of violence. The problem of reading ritual from debris is the problem of motive. Objects do not tell us why they were set down. We must triangulate context in the soil, comparable patterns in other sites, and the living archive of folklore. Where all three converge, interpretation grows confident. Where they diverge, we must keep our voice low and our claims hedged. Consider an excavation near an ancient ring site, where layers of burnt turf alternated with pottery that shows soot in consistent rims, and where a scatter of animal bone lay beyond the living surface. The soil chemistry speaks to repeated burning. The pottery sizes suggest communal consumption. The bones show careful butchery and the selection of particular cuts. Taken together, pattern, placement, repeatability, they make a strong case for ritual feasting tied to communal rites of seasonality. But the archaeologist will still speak of probability, not certainty. Labels are kept cautious, assemblage suggestive of repeated communal burning and feasting. The tone is deliberate, because to mistake practical domestic pattern for ritual, or vice versa, is to rewrite a culture in error. Then there are the mute testaments that startle the modern eye. Charred animal bone placed in shallow pits near mounds. The deliberate breakage of pottery, not for repair, but for deposition. The careful placement of a skull beneath threshold stone. These acts show intent. Breakage is closure. Deliberately smashing a vessel before placing it in the ground seems to enact a finality. A bone placed in a hollow may be memory meant to be kept. Such patterns recur in disparate places, suggesting a shared grammar of offering. Give something valuable, meat, vessel, ornament, and define a relationship across a boundary that is both material and metaphysical. The objects, in their mute way, record an economy of obligation. Archaeology also reveals adaptation. As Christian institutions spread, the material record shows continuities and changes. Earlier open-air deposit patterns sometimes shift toward church-adjacent burials. Ritual objects are found in reworked contexts. Symbols of old belief appear marginally in Christian settings. This is not simply replacement, it is negotiation in stone and soil. The same mound that once held offerings may later receive a cross or a Christian grave. Not erasure, but layering. People continued to deposit, to feed, to remember, but often beneath a different script. The dirt keeps both stories.
The tools archaeologists use, radiocarbon dating, isotopic analysis, GIS landscape mapping, can tighten the circle of inference. Radiocarbon can place a charred deposit to within centuries. Isotope studies can reveal the diet of animals placed in ritual contexts. Landscape mapping shows how ritual clusters connect to travel routes or watercourses. In recent decades, bog science has advanced so that peat stratigraphy yields seasonality. A hearth deposit sealed within a particular peat growth band may be tied to autumnal depositional patterns. These scientific refinements make the old stories legible in a new tongue, not proof of Samhain as an event on a calendar, but evidence that communities practiced repeated, seasonally timed rituals in which fire, food, and boundary markers played central roles. Yet the most compelling thing about material culture is how the fragments invite us to imagine lives intimate and brutal. A shard of pottery with a soot line is not merely an object, it belonged in a hand. It was passed from mouth to mouth in a cold room. Its owner may have been named and had debts. A rib bone bearing cut marks speaks of a hand with a knife deciding, in a winter decision, which life to keep. Objects ground the abstract, the idea of obligation, the fear of winter, the negotiation with the dead,
into human scale. They make the rituals plausible and the stories credible without giving them away. So when we stand at a dig and lay finger on charcoal under peat, when we lift a bowl and find a smear of fat on its rim, we're touching the margins of memory. The past leaves fragments, charred peat, broken pots, marked stones, and with careful reading, we can trace the outlines of a night that balanced economy with reverence, food with contract, and social order with the risk of the uncanny. What the soil preserves is neither sermon nor saga. It is evidence, sometimes generous, sometimes stubbornly mute, that a people met the dark with practice and artistry. Objects do not pronounce, but they do record, a ledger written in bone and grit that when read patiently confirms what the hollow hills and the old tales insist, that Samhain was lived not only in story, but in the precise gestures of daily survival, ritualized into shape on the peat and stone. And so the past, in fragments, speaks back. The present reanimates them by listening closely, by holding the finds against the memory of the stories, by letting folklore and science argue until their agreement becomes the clearest voice we have.
The present reanimates it, not only with trowels and peat cores, but with rituals, symbols, and strange modern echoes whispered in candlelit rooms. The calendar turns, the fields grow bare, and once more, October gives way to a night that wears many faces. Samhain is no longer only buried in mounds and bogs, it walks among us now, dressed in both reverence and glitter. What was once a fire-lit rite beneath cold stars has become a festival of masks, tarot cards, covens, and supermarket aisles. The ancient night has not ended, it has adapted. In the late 19th century, when folklore was being collected like pressed leaves, certain European and American circles began to revive what they believed were the old ways. These early occultists, theosophists, spiritualists, ceremonial magicians looked to Samhain as more than a harvest festival. To them, it was a hinge in the year, a portal between visible and invisible worlds. They built rituals on fragments, Druidic speculation, Celtic revival literature, and whispered rural customs. What emerged was less a reconstruction than an invention that believed itself ancient, a new language stitched from old syllables. As the 20th century advanced, new spiritual movements grew around this night. Wicca, Gardnerian witchcraft, and neo-paganism, these sought to reclaim Samhain as a sacred festival, the witches' new year. In these circles, Samhain is a ritual pivot, a night for opening circles, for calling ancestors, for lighting candles to mark the thinning of the veil. It is not an exact survival of old rites, no one truly knows those, but an act of deliberate remembering, of reaching backward into shadow to build something alive. Candles still flicker, but now in living rooms and forest clearings. Tarot spreads are laid on black velvet, calling forth archetypes: the Tower, the High Priestess, Death. These cards are not ancient Celtic artifacts. They are products of Renaissance Italy and occult modernism. Yet, on Samhain night, they gain gravity. Practitioners speak of the thinning of the veil as if the world itself exhales and lets its seams loosen. The dead are invited, not to terrify, but to be spoken to. Some write names on slips of paper, burning them in bowls of salt. Others whisper invocations to forgotten gods in languages they have resurrected from footnotes. There is sincerity here, real belief, real yearning.
In a world that often feels hollow, the pull of an old night promises meaning. But Samhain's revival has two faces. One is quiet, the small coven beneath the trees, the solitary practitioner lighting a single candle, tracing invisible boundaries in the air. The other face is louder, brighter, plastic pumpkins under supermarket lights, fog machines, horror movie marathons, mass-produced witch hats. The ancient Feast of Thresholds has become a billion-dollar spectacle. The commercial mask now smiles where once a bone-white turnip lantern glared. Halloween, exported, commercialized, and wrapped in orange cellophane, carries only fragments of its ancestor. The costumes, the trick-or-treating, the candy, these are echoes without origin. And yet, even here, in the midst of spectacle, the ritual breathes. Beneath the mask of a cartoon witch, someone still believes. In the corner of a crowded party, someone draws a quiet sigil on their wrist.
In modern occultism, Samhain is a time of power. Contemporary witches call it the witch's Sabbath of endings. Many rituals focus on shadow work, confronting fears, honoring the dead, or closing cycles. Some use divination to glimpse the coming year. Others conduct banishing rites to cut ties with what festers in the dark. In these acts, Samhain becomes both mirror and blade. But the modern hunger for authenticity is a dangerous thing. It tempts people to romanticize the past, to imagine lost druids dancing in a perfect forest, to call every scrap of folklore ancient truth. History, however, is rarely that generous. What survives is fragment, not scripture. To build modern rites on those fragments is not wrong, but to mistake them for unbroken lineage is to make the past into a puppet. Some occult circles know this. They call their rituals reimaginings, acknowledging their creative hand. Others, less cautious, claim ancient bloodlines that never existed. Samhain, in these hands, becomes a theater. Ritual becomes costume. And yet the night doesn't care what name it wears. Whether sung in Old Irish, whispered in Latin, or packaged in plastic, the threshold still stands. The air on Samhain night holds the same weight it always has, a soft pressure at the back of the neck, as if the world itself is listening. For some, the festival is spiritual. For others, it is performance. For many, it is simply play. But beneath every glowing pumpkin, beneath every whispered incantation or cheerful costume, there is an old structure still breathing. Fire, darkness, masks, memory. In many modern covens, the ritual opens with a circle, salt or chalk. Then candles are placed at the 4 cardinal points. An invocation is spoken. Ancestors are named. Silence follows. The world feels thinner, like parchment stretched too far. Then the feast begins. Food laid for both living and dead. Apples cut, bread broken. Not so different from the hearth feasts of the old mounds, though now the language has changed. The shape, however, remains. In cities, too, echoes linger. Wiccans gather in community halls. Occultists perform tarot readings in cafes. Ghost tours wind through cobbled streets where costumed actors tell tales of witches and banshees. It is easy to dismiss this as play acting, but the human impulse beneath it, to acknowledge death, to court mystery, to stand on the edge of the year and feel the dark breathe, is very old. Samhain is neither fully ancient nor entirely modern now.
It is a layered night, part archive, part invention, part spectacle. It belongs to druids imagined, witches real, historians cautious, marketers loud, children thrilled, and spirits, perhaps, still waiting. And so the night persists, adapting itself to each century's mouth. No matter the costume it wears, Samhain always finds a way to speak, because the night is never finished. It remakes itself each year.
And as the wind moves once more through the hollows and peat mounds, the world exhales. The fields are bare, the hearths burn low, and the last whisper of Samhain slips through the cracks of the year. In that thin hour, too late to belong to one day, too early to claim another, the land remembers. It always does. The hollow hills are quiet now, but silence is not absence. Beneath their mossy skin lie old names, old bargains, and old doors that were never truly shut. The embers of the great bonfires are ash, scattered by the night wind. Yet one candle remains, unlit, waiting. It stands alone on a peat mound, its wax streaked like the bark of an ancient tree. No hand claims it, no face watches it. And yet, if one listens long enough, the air around it moves as though something draws near. That is the way of Samhain. What is buried is never quite gone. It lingers at the edge of vision, behind the mist, under the soil, and in the spaces where memory turns to shadow. Each year, when the veil thins and the night folds back on itself, the world tilts just enough for those old things to breathe again. Scholars may trace its rites, pagans may revive its name, markets may turn it to spectacle. But the hills, they remember more than books ever will. They remember the sound of fire cracking against fog. They remember the cattle lowing between flames. They remember the footsteps that approached but never returned. And somewhere in the dark, between the breath of the wind and the rustle of the dry reeds, something listens still, not to prayers, not to cries, but to the steady rhythm of human hearts that dare to remember. So, if on Halloween's night you light a single candle, be mindful where you place it. The old ways still walk softly, and the hills are patient. If the hollow hills still whisper where you live, tell us their secret below. Light no more than a single candle and keep a seat empty when Halloween's night unfolds. For some guests never leave. Subscribe to Arcane Chronicles and step beyond the threshold where myth is not memory, but a living thing that still watches from the dark.